you ready?
Always.
Go on then, over to you.
Right, I'll start with a rider. I'm not a yeast expert or a starter expert, so these are just some thoughts about what I do and what I thought I learned, and I've kind of threw some, there's no slides, I just threw some thoughts together, and I gave this to beer bores. People were asking around how we make starters and things, so I'm just going to run through that. So where I go wrong, or if you do something different, feel free to just chip in and say, because I don't think I probably do everything right. I'm gonna go from there. So I'm just going to talk about starters, I guess, more than yeast. So let's start with what is a starter. So a starter is essentially a way to grow yeast up using some wort, essentially, that's generally unhopped. So essentially, rather than buy a lot of dry yeast, or a lot of wet yeast, a lot of packets of yeast, if you need 400 billion cells, rather than spend 4 lots of £8, you can use a starter using some cheaper DME or some wort that you've saved from a beer or made on your pico or whatever to grow up some yeast. So you can do that. So it's like a beer, but it's not a beer. So you can use much higher temperatures. You're not trying to essentially drive flavors, you're just trying to drive yeast growth, but it's essentially the same as making a beer. It just won't necessarily taste as good at the end of it. And like I say, it's unhopped. So why would you do it? So like I said, it's expensive. The other thing you can do, or what I do, is if you are interested in buying one piece, if you've got a favorite yeast and you want to keep reusing it and not have to buy it each time, then you can actually you can harvest yeast from a beer. But a good way, or a better way I think to do it, is you make a bigger starter and say split it in half, and then you've got yeast for your next beer, or for keeping in your fridge for when you next want to use it, that hasn't been exposed to any beer. Particularly if you're making strong beers or whatever, your yeast is going to be a bit tired and you might not want to harvest it. So you can keep 4 or 5 strains on the go and do that. A third reason is you do know before you put that into your beer that yeast is working. So you've grown up the yeast, it's as healthy as it can be, it's pretty fresh, you've just made it, you've seen it's active, so when you put it into your beer, it's good, it's going to work. All right. So how do you make? Let's see if I can share a screen. So how do you make a starter? Well, like I say, essentially you are making some unhopped wort. So essentially it's pretty easier if you're using dried malt extract. You can see my screen now. And essentially, it's a pretty easy calculation. You want to make something around 1036, 1040.
Am I the only person who can't see your screen?
Yeah, we can't see your screen yet.
Okay. Back. Where's Zoom gone? I can't get back to the Zoom meeting.
Can you put the hat on?
The what?
The hat. Can you put the hat on?
Hang on. Clicks. Can you see that?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, okay. So essentially you want to make some wort about 1036, 1040, and that's really easy to do with DME. Essentially 100 grams of DME and a litre of water will make you 100 grams of DME and make it up to a litre of water will give you a litre of the right strength DME. Couple of tricks for making it up. Essentially, you do need to sanitize it, so you are going to boil it for at least 15 minutes. DME is really sticky, spray dried wort.
Yeah, I think there's still a bit of an issue with the screen. I don't think we can actually see your screen. We can see that you've started sharing, but we can't see what is actually.
Yeah, it's got a black screen at the moment. think
Okay,
to be
well,
fair, Lee did say that he hadn't made any slides, so that's probably
I'm just showing a picture, but it's not necessary really. So it's just literally a little bottle of wort. So yeah, you do have to boil it up. So you'll find DME is really sticky. A little trick for making it up is it dissolves up really nicely in cold water. And you don't get any steam or heat off that then makes the rest of your bag of DME sticky. So what I tend to do, I've got a hot plate stirrer, but you can make it up in a pan on the stove, is weigh out if you're making a litre starter, weigh out 100 grams of DME, add some cold water, and give it a bit of a shake to dissolve. I've got a stirrer bar, etc., so I'll put that on the hot plate stirrer and stir it round. Once it's pretty much dissolved, then I'll top it up to a litre with boiling water just to save that time in terms of boiling it. You boil it for 15 minutes and cool it down. Boil overs are a real problem, especially if you're using a conical flask or something with a narrow neck, which is probably best to use, because then you can cover the neck later. So I use a little bit of silicone-based antifoam. You only need a tiny smidgen. What I do is put a little bit on the end of the thermometer that I'm using and put that in, and that essentially means that you can turn that on and walk away. And I'm sure anyone who's made starters beforehand will have had a lot of messy boil overs. So a little bit of antifoam just stops that and means you can just set it all off, go away. I check back on it as soon as I can see that it's boiling. I'll set a timer for 15 minutes, come back at the end, take it off. Can anybody see anything yet? Is anything showing? Yeah. So essentially, yeah, this is my hot plate stirrer. So you can see it's hot. Basically, I'll then cool it down. So I'll just take that. I'll put a bit of silver foil over the top and put it in. I generally, I've got a table outside in the garden, just under cover. I'll put it on that for a little bit just to cool down, and then I'll go dunk it in some cold water. And essentially, you just want to cool it down to around room temperature or wherever your yeast is. You probably just want to get it somewhere below sort of 20 or 30, sorry, below about 30. I'm quite happy as long as it's sort of 25 or whatever. I'm going to add the wort to it. I don't worry too much about shocking the yeast when it's getting warmer rather than colder. I will take the yeast packet out if I use Y yeast and smack it and, let that warm up for a few hours. But essentially, as soon as that's cooled down, you can then pitch the yeast, sanitize the vial or the packet. Wipe that, spray that with some sanitizer, spray the scissors or whatever, pour that in, and allow that starter to run. Just put it somewhere warm in the house. Actually, increased temperatures are good. Anything up to about 30 will mean you'll get faster work and faster yeast growth. And essentially, pretty much everything that the yeast are going to do are going to be done within about 24 hours. So you start with some sort of, dishwatery looking, Pico brew looking wort. Let's see if that flips. Has that changed for everyone or?
Yeah.
So I don't know if the colours are seeing, but you can see that it starts to go much more yellow. I actually hear a difference in the spinning of the stirrer bar, and essentially you can pretty much tell with a bit of experience when your starter is done or not. If you've got oxygen, you can add it, especially for things like lager. I'll buzz a little bit of oxygen in there. Or also if I've seen something and a day later it still looks pretty murky or doesn't seem to have gone thick like I'm used to, then I'll blast a bit more oxygen in, and that tends to get it going again. So it's essentially, get some DME, boil it up, sanitize it, cool it down, add the yeast, aerate it, oxygenate it, let it run for 12-24 hours, and then it's ready to go. In terms of the oxygenation, I'll show you on a yeast calculator later, but you get a lot more growth if you have a stir bar or a stirrer plate. Essentially, yeast will replicate and bud essentially, rather than start to ferment and make beer until they've used up all of the oxygen that's in the solution and all of the other things that they use to make cell walls to bud and make new yeast cells. So essentially, by having some movement on the surface, you're allowing a lot more oxygen to get in. So you get a certain amount of yeast growth if you just shake the hell out of it and then pitch your yeast. You get a bit more if you can come back and shake the hell out of it a couple of times. And you get a lot more if you can just use a stir plate. And that's why essentially this silver foil cover is to stop stuff dripping in, but you just put it loosely over the top so you can get oxygen in. If I walk past it, I'll often take that off and just blow in there just to try and replicate and just try and move the air around. And essentially it will do that. Once it starts fermenting, that's it. It's tripped over into that mode. You're not going to go back into replication. So you'll see it. You'll sometimes see it bubbling. Sometimes you get a bit of foam. Sometimes you don't see anything at all. But within 12 to 24 hours, that cycle of the starter is completely done. I'll pause there. Any questions? Anyone do anything different?
Yes. So when you say the cycle of starter is done 12-24 hours, I think that depends whether you're going to be pitching your starter in full into your beer, or you're actually going to wait until yeast flocks out.
Yeah, absolutely. I just mean the growth phase surge. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I find usually start to end, if you will, the full fermentation between 3 to sometimes 5 days, but I use different wort gravities in a fixed volume to grow the number of cells that I need. So sometimes I actually make up a start of, say 10, 35, 36, which is what's usually recommended. But quite often I'll make a 1045 start if I'm after a lot of yeast. And that obviously takes a couple of extra days to finish well fermenting.
Yeah.
And if your yeast is not very flocculent, you might need to let it sit for a while and then cold crash in the fridge. But I'm assuming you're going to get to all those points later on.
Yeah, I will.
What's your hot plate stirrer, Lee? I've not seen one of those.
Yes, it's just a typical lab hot plate stirrer. So essentially, this part heats up, so it just has electricity going through it, and it gets very hot. This little thing comes out to tell you that it's hot. You got a temperature control over here, but it's not precise. So on 10, it's on all the time. On 9, it's on, and then every now and then it clicks off.
Yeah.
And so on. So it's on full, but then stops. And then a stirrer on this side. But it just means you can do it all in one place. And crucially, I can just stir it while it's starting to boil. So as soon as I can start moving that DME around, it goes. They are horrifically expensive, unless you work for a large company that's always shutting down labs, and you can speak to the lab manager and they give you one. It does have its drawbacks. You have to remember to turn it off. I have actually once cooled the yeast down. I turned the machine off to let that cool down. Then I put it on to let it stir. And went back in, and 30 minutes later, and the yeast was at 50 degrees because I hadn't turned the heat off. And I thought it was buggered, but I cooled it all down, and it fermented absolutely fine. So amazing how robust the yeast are. But I do actually have two. I've got a little. I've got another one as well, which is just the stirrer, which is a bit smaller. And I find even when you've not got any heat going to it on this, that will actually just just the movement. And this one doesn't have any moving parts. It just has an electromagnetic field that goes round, but it does generate some heat, and it'll probably add 4 or 5 degrees to the temperature, to the ambient temperature. And then you've got the yeast activity as well, so it makes it quite nice and warm. It's pretty good.
And just one question, you said that after sort of 24 hours, it's good to go. Does that mean kind of ready to pitch, or?
Yeah, I'll talk about that in a sec, I think. So,
Okay, cool.
In terms of the cycle, so that's the yeast just boiling. Let's see, what else have I got? Yeah, that's a bit before where it's looking a bit dirty. I think that's the work just after I boiled it, so you can see it has sedimented out, but it's clear. Then you add the yeast and it goes a bit grey. But because it's in the sun, I do sometimes cover it up. If it's going to get a lot of sun, I just put a towel or something around it, just if there's bright sunlight to do it. And then you've got a couple of options really. So some people pitch that into their work. I don't. I don't know if you've smelt it or tasted a bit. I think there is a percentage that people say as long as you're under this percentage, you won't notice it in your beer. But I think if you're spending all that time making the nicest beer you can, why add something that isn't? So I do what Serge does, and I make this well in advance, at least a week ahead. And then I put it in the fridge when I've got the right amount of yeast cells. Let's see. I think I've got a picture of that. And let it sediment out. It should come out. And then I pour off the supernatant, so the liquid on the top, leave a little bit because the yeast can be quite dense underneath, and just swirl that round. So I'll put it in the fridge, I'll leave the whole lot on, and then on brew day, it's one of the first things I do when I'm setting up, is I take it out the fridge, I pour off most of the crap on the top, give it a swirl, and then I'll put it back on the hot plate and let it spin up for the rest of the day and get up to normal temperatures or pitching temperatures. And I do know that some people take a little bit of the work that they've made in the beer, and whilst they're cooling it and that, they'll put that in the starter and get that starting to lively up the yeast a bit as well. But I don't do that. I just pitch it straight into the fermenter afterwards. Doesn't seem to be showing it.
When you pour off the liquid,
yeah,
that's at that point I tend to pour off a little into a glass and let it warm up a bit and then taste it just to check that I'm not about to pitch something nasty, which has happened before.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you've got to be scrupulously clean, haven't you? I just I normally sniff it, but here you can see a lot of it. It drops out pretty quick. And actually, once you if you've got a stir plate and you just turn it off, you'll know when it's finished, because within a minute or so you start to see it sediment out. If it doesn't do that, then it's probably still fermented, and you can leave it go. So it's about 1900 ml starter. You can see you've got about 200 ml of yeast slurry in there. That'll go down a little bit more when it's in the fridge.
And if you're saving something for later, this is the point when you want to separate. So you don't put something in a jar into your fridge after the first growth phase, because then you have a lot of unfermented sugars and you're going to get an explosion in your fridge. So you only take some to store after it's fully fermented out. Yeah.
So what I do, Serge, and I can go through the calculations and that a bit in a minute, is my first step is really to take the yeast that I've got and to grow it up to 200 billion cells. And the reason I do that is if you then split that in half, you've got essentially what would be a fresh out of the door Y yeast or White Lab sample of 100 billion. And the other half is the other pack that you've also just bought from White Labs that I then split off, store one, and then I start my calculations for what I want from the beer from the 100 billion. So, that's if I've kept it a while. Obviously, if it's 99%, if it's really fresh and I'm using it straight away, you don't need to do that. So that's what I'll do. And I think Fraser probably runs off and splits it into 4 or whatever, but I always just split it in 2 and then start. If you pour off the supernatant, you can end up with just a sludge and you can't get it out. So you do have to leave a little bit of fluid in there to be able to mobilize it.
Can I suggest another way of doing starters rather than making malt extract is to take a couple of litres from the last brew that you've done, put it into a container, freeze it, then reboil it and put it into a flask.
Yep.
Boil it in a flask. So you've got a beer that is very similar to what you're actually brewing, whether it be a lager,
Right.
bitter, or a stout or Belgium ale. You know, you can have several of this kind of containers in the freezer, take it out, reboil it, and then add your yeast. So you're actually getting a yeast that is multiplying rather than freezing it.
Yeah.
And then it will actually sort of multiply as you put it into the beer. And you can use oxygen for something like that. It's just another way of looking at it rather than from making a malt extract starter. You've actually got a proper beer that you can actually pitch into the beer that you're actually brewing.
Yep, it's a good idea. I've done the same, Phil, where I've made a RIS or something, and the runnings at the end, you've stopped at 1040, but you can just flush a load of water in and essentially end up with a load of what is essentially starter, and then I freeze it and thaw it all. One thing I would say is when you freeze it, that there will be some separation of the sugary part, and you'll see, you know, when you freeze sugary stuff, you end up with a lot of white crystals, which is all the sugar, and then all the water, and the sugar have concentrated in the other. So if you do freeze something, defrost the lot. Don't defrost the first 100 mils because you'll just get the sugar. And then what I've done as well, even if it's weaker, is then just used a calculator and, you know, only had to add 20 grams of DME rather than 100 because it's pretty expensive, DME.
Any DME because you're actually adding beer that you fermented previously.
Yeah, it's a good nuance, Phil, to do it same sort of style or whatever. Yeah.
Funny story. I tried to do that once many years ago when I didn't have much experience, and I ran off the mash tun straight into some bottles, some clean and sterile bottles, and I just capped them and put them in the shed. And about a week later, I went into the shed. And I thought, what's that awful smell? And it's like there's broken glass everywhere.
Yeah.
So don't do that.
Yeah, I've tried putting them in bags as well. You know, the Ziploc bags, and I've had them burst when you freeze, and then my freezer's defrosted or something, and ended up with everywhere. So I think those milk containers are probably a good idea, Phil. If you're going to be keeping it ages, you can always boil it first as well, just to make sure nothing's growing.
Well, it comes straight out of the fermenter as cooling. Yeah, normally it's the first runnings, and then you don't fill it right up. You leave it about 3/4 full, and then you've got the expansion. And I've never had a problem with that. So.
Yeah.
Lee, if you're doing a lager starter, do you do it at lager temperatures or do you just do it at normal ambient temperatures?
Again, warm. I mean, what you're trying to do with a lager is suppress the ester formation. And this is the thing. So, some people say you should try and make your wort and your temperature the same as the beer that you're going to make, right? So that the yeast are doing a similar thing. But yeah, I've made my lager ones. I just use them warm again. I'm quite happy to put anything up to, like I say, about 30 degrees C. I'm quite happy to run my thing out. But then I'm pouring that bit of beer away. I think if you were going to put that in your beer, then I would say, go a bit slower, because you wouldn't need a lot of it.
So as long as you cold crash and discard, then it's fine.
Yeah.
And then there's no temperature shock because you've started at a higher temperature.
Yeah. Just cool it slowly and then get them on to 12.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, I think I might have missed that. How do you do the splitting? Like, effectively, do you split into two batches by, like, before it's settled? Like, how do you physically do that when you split the two 100 million batches? Like, out of your 200 million.
With this, I would drain it, just so that I can see a little bit of liquid in the bottom over the top.
Yeah.
And then I would swirl that around. And then I would pour that out into, just roughly into two different things to store them in. So I've stored them in what like little plastic centrifuge vials. So they're like, I guess they're like very thin-walled test tubes. The old White Labs vials were good. You could sanitize and use those again because they were very thick-walled. The best thing that I found, and I think you could probably get these in a bulk buy, are actually things they use for cell culture in the labs. And so they're sterile, but the lid that goes on top of them has a sterile filter in. So then you don't have to go in. So if you're storing yeast for a long time in your fridge, you might have to go and just burp the lids every now and then because they will ferment a bit and get a little bit of pressure. But obviously with a filter in the lid, it's just venting the gas. And if it needs to pull any gas in, it's sterile going in. So they're ideal. I can try and post a link to them. I think they weren't actually that dear. You just got to buy 100 of them or something, so it'd be good as a club. But a lot of people used jam jars, and you just boil the jam jars up, sanitize them. You do want a bit of beer on the top. Yeah, you just want to reduce that down so you're not storing 1.5 litres. You just want to be storing mainly slurry with a bit of beer on top.
Yeah, the way I do it.
Yeah,
I've got some of those they're like American style jars which have like the 2-part lids. So they've got an outer ring and then the actual top lid bit, so you can actually screw the outer ring down but not the whole way. And then the top lid just sits on top of the glass, so it keeps it closed, but if it needs to release any gas it can just pop that open a bit.
right. Yeah.
And they're
Sorry, they're called mason jars.
Yeah.
I've been looking at them loads recently. They're quite pricey, but I suppose if you're going to go ahead with this sort of thing, then it's probably worth.
Yeah, I bought half a dozen. I think they're 400 ml or something like that. But so I just use them for storing slurry after I've removed the beer into a keg. Stick that in my fridge.
If you constantly do starters, like I do for every single beer gets a starter, you don't actually need to store a whole 400 ml, because if you think of how much actual slurry is in a White Labs vial or a white yeast packet, it's actually not much. So 125 mils mason jars are perfect, because actually you can store more slurry than any of the commercial ones. Probably good 200 billion with still half of beer left, and they take almost no space in the fridge.
Yeah, I agree. I should have bought the smaller jars in the end, and I may well yet do that because they do take up a bit more space.
I think the White Labs have about 40 mils in Surge.
Yeah, so you can like, yeah, you don't need a huge jar. I know it looks scary when you have just a little bit of yeast, but it's actually still more than the White Labs.
Yeah.
So I'll put it up on the starter anyway.
I've been looking into this quite a lot recently because I'm interested in having a go and thinking about doing it. And most of the stuff you read online with all the brewing websites and you see videos of, they seem to suggest making the starter like 2 or 3, as you said, a couple of days before, and then you can pour it in. But everyone here who seems to be doing it seems to be suggesting about doing it sort of a week in advance and then fridging it to cold crash it so you can separate it out. Is that just because it makes it life easier, because obviously you can then do it whenever you're ready and keep it for a good couple of weeks until you want to pitch it? Or is it actually better than doing it only 24 hours, 36 hours in advance and pouring the whole lot in?
Well, for me, I don't want to add all the stuff on the top. And if you're waiting a day, you're going to be pouring a lot of that away. So you're fine. I don't know if you can see on this, you can see you've got some heavy yeast at the bottom. Then you've got this clear part here. If you wait a day or two, you're going to be throwing all this away.
Right.
And actually, it's all that fine. What they say is the fine yeast is what drives attenuation. So you've got the flocculent yeast at the bottom that's falling out. That will do your initial fermentation, and then that finer stuff is remaining in suspension and is driving your attenuation at the end. So you're essentially throwing that away. Now that's probably not a problem if you're just making one beer and you pitched a lot of yeast. If you're splitting the yeast and keeping a set, and then you're later on down the line doing the same again, if you're not keeping all of that yeast, you're gradually going towards having the more flocculent yeast and not the others, and you might see a drop off in your attenuation. So the other thing is, if you do it a week before and it don't work, you can probably get another packet. If you do it 2 days before and it don't work, you're probably just using your spare packs of dry yeast that you keep for that.
Yeah, and also different yeasts obviously ferment at different speeds. And doing it a week ahead, at least 5 days ahead, ensures that fermentation is fully done. All of that yeast suspension has attenuated, it flocks out, etc. And you just end up with much more diverse pitch, and you're not in a rush. Because sometimes, like when I started, I did have to pitch like the starter that was already fermented. Yeast has already started dropping out, but I need to pitch, and it's still in suspension. You end up with all that supernatant, and half the time it smells horrible and tastes even worse, especially if it's, let's say, a lager yeast and you've just done your starter at 25 say.
Yeah, it's like horrible oxidized dry malt extract beer.
Yeah, it's not very nice.
I suppose if you do the process that I'm sorry, I forget the chap's name that mentioned about taking some green beer and putting it in the fridge or in the freezer and then using it, so it is the same beer. I suppose in that sense you could put the whole lot in, because if it's the same beer as the one you're actually making, then it's not going to be the same as you say, the DME. But
well, if you're growing the starter at roughly the same temperature as fermentation, yeah. But if you freeze some lager wort and then you grow it up at 25 C, I still wouldn't pitch that into my next lager.
No, fair enough.
So I had a question about the smack packs. I've ordered a yeast for the first time, and as I say, I only make smaller batches. I'm planning to use it on a sort of 10-litre batch, which I recognise is half of what most people kind of do, or 19 litres or 5 gallons, whatever. Bearing in mind I won't be using all of it, is it advisable? I possibly don't need the starter because I've probably got enough cells, but if I want to make best use of what's left, it's probably best to make a starter and then split it out anyway. Does that sound right based on what you've described?
David, what's the size of your batch?
In a minute, I'll go through how you work out how much yeast and how big a sample you use. Yeah, so that probably cover it then. I'm just trying to find where my wife put my info, but I think she's tidied it somewhere.
What was the question? There was a question as well.
But if you're only doing a 10-litre and you've got enough yeast for a 5-gallon batch, then my suggestion would be don't use all the yeast. Yeast creates flavour as it grows, and if you overpitch, you can end up stripping out hop character and flavour from the beer.
I think that was the question there, Paul. What to do with the other half?
No, but it's a good point, because I could pitch the whole thing, and then, as you say, you wouldn't stress it enough to get some nice esters and fruity stuff. So maybe it is worth splitting it out and not using it all. And then the question is, then how do you do that?
And you're starting with what? A smack pack, do you say?
Yeah, it's a smack pack. It's a I can't remember the number. I think it might be 1332. It's the one that was the Gales Brewery one originally. I'm brewing a Gales Ale, a clone. So.
Okay. Yeah. I've used that yeast in the past. What would I do with it? Oof. You want to take half of what's in the smack pack and use it, and the other half you want to do something with. So I guess you've got to work out a way of measuring that. So I guess you need a sterile vessel to pour the contents into, to then to be able to measure out half of that, and then the other half of it you could put in a sterile glass jar with a bit of boiled and cooled water that will keep yeast healthy for a while. A good couple of months in the fridge under some sterile boiled water, obviously cooled when you add it on top.
Or David,
is it okay storing it with its nutrients like that?
No, you should. Yeast, when it goes into its dormant phase, it builds up its cell walls and its glycol stores, and it gets itself ready to go to a dormant state. So it should be healthy enough sitting there quietly. As soon as you start activating it, then it starts breaking down its reserves, and if it it's got nowhere to go. If it's got a little bit of food but not enough, it'll deplete itself and end up dying. So if it's stored yeast, like from a smack pack or whatever, I guess you're activating it right as part of the smack pack process. So yeah, that would be an issue then, wouldn't it? It'll be starting to grow.
So
if it came from a
maybe
white
it's safer
labs,
maybe it's safer then to make a starter, and then you know that you're storing it without, it's dormant at a point in time, and then split it out as described.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, if it was a white labs one, you could probably get away with just halving it and putting some in a jar and with some water on top of it. But yeah, you're right. With the smack pack, it will start it to grow because it's got nutrients, and when you combine it right. Or the other thing is you could cut the pack open, not do a smack pack, but cut the pack open, take out half of the yeast from the, because there's two packets inside, isn't it? There's the growth medium, and then there's the yeast. And by smacking it, you join them two together, don't you?
One of your options would be to get a 500 ml or a litre sparkling water bottle, tip out the contents so you know it's sterile, squirt half the smack pack in, and then when you've finished making your worts, just stick maybe, I don't know, 200, 300, 400 ml on top of it. Put the top on, but then put some foil over the top, or just put the top on very, very loosely and sit it next to the fermenter, so it will effectively ferment out like a starter. And then once it's done, you could put the top on the bottle and stick it in the fridge, and you're all ready to go for next time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I don't know if you can see this video. I didn't mention earlier, quite often at the end of fermentation, you'll start to see, depending on the yeast, it flocculates out. I don't know, is it not? I don't know if you'll see the action there, but you can see the big lumps that will join together, and you can tell it's finished then. I think Nottingham does that. This, bizarrely enough, is Zurich yeast at the beginning of a starter. The weirdest yeast I've ever had, the one we used for the Santa Claus, and it never changed from that, just massive lumps right from the off. So that might be the other way. You see different yeast do different things, and some of them really, really clump up. I think it's Nottingham that really, really clumps up. Okay, right, so that's the mechanics of why and how and what to do to make a single starter. I said there were different options there, from pitching the lot to chilling it down and keeping it, splitting it, or whatever. But sometimes you haven't grown enough yeast that actually you want to go ahead and grow that up again and maybe make that a little bit bigger. And I'll go through the calculations of what you might do to do that. But and I don't know how many other people do what I do, but essentially if I'm going from, say, a 1 litre starter to a 2 litre starter, rather than let it all settle out for 5 days and then make myself a 2 litre starter, I just make another litre of starter fluid, twice as strong as it should be before. And I haven't yet got round to taking into account the fact that there's probably some residual sugars from the first one. Boil that up, cool it down. Once I know the other one's finished its fermentation, then I'll just add that back in and do that and save any transfers. And I know then I'm going from the boiling vessel to another one. So, you may go with a step starter, particularly for lagers, you might go to 1 litre to 2 litres to 5 litres. And rather than cool it down each time, I just add the additional starter that I've made up. Does anyone else do that, or does anyone else do anything different?
I just, if let's say the recipe and this particular recipe and OG or whatnot, take it into account, viability requires me to grow the yeast to, let's say, 300 cells. I just grow it to 400 cells, and then I take when I pitch it, I just take roughly, let's say, a fourth and store it, or a third or a half, or whatever it is that I need, and that's it. So I don't do the double pitches. Just my starter is always 2 liters, at the gravity that I need to grow, the cells for the beer plus 100. And then whatever that 100 is out of that proportion is what gets stored.
But in terms of your strategy, Lee, for adding wort, at each stage, I would do the same. It just saves, because also then you're not risking transferring it around from container to container, are you? Sort of minimizing the risk of that as well,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, but I think it's possibly an unnecessary step. Just make up as much wort as you need to grow for the beer and for what you want to store.
Did you see my presentation on the Santa Claus, Serge? My starter would have been about 250 litres.
Yes, I remember that one. But that's kind of that's very much an edge case scenario. I don't think people usually brew 15% lagers.
But so I think it depends how much you brew, Serge. So I brew 33 litres and pretty much always having to do a starter.
Mm-hmm.
Very rarely do I get away with just doing one starter. It's almost always a step starter.
Fair. I usually get away with my 2 liter flask for a standard sort of like 20 liter batch, and then but sometimes like for this Belgian blonde, I had to my starter was 1046, and that took nearly a week to fully ferment out, etc.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm just lazy.
No. I mean, if you can do it in one go, you do it in one go. I know Fraser does it in one go as well. I tend to, as DME was dear, I've kind of worked out a way to try and minimize the amount of DME that you're using. But it's a balance between that and the number of transfers and growths you have to do and the risk you're taking at each stage.
I must admit, for 40 litres, I find it as well very difficult to do it. If you place any credence in the cell calculators, it's almost impossible to do in a single step. You've got to do it in that 5 or 10-fold growth thing. Otherwise, I certainly couldn't do this to mine.
I've not encountered that, I guess, due to lack of really huge volume brewing. So interesting, actually. Haven't even thought about that.
Yeah. Right, so that covers kind of why we're doing what we're doing, how we're doing it, and then I thought I'd just talk about how do you know how much to grow, and what options do you have essentially, and my thoughts on that, and most of this is just taken from the yeast book, and I'm not going to explain it very well, the Jamil Zainasheff one. For me, it's an excellent read. It's the only decent read out of the 4 different books, and the interesting thing here is learning how to think about yeast and yeast growth. So if you go to a standard calculator, like if I pick up this just Beersmith here, I've got a 1050 wort beer. I'm making 33 litres. If you go to the starter button on Beersmith, or you can put this into any online starter and say, I'm making this much beer at this strength, it will tell you how many yeast cells do you need, right? So here it says 410 billion, right? That's how many it says I should be pitching. You're buying 100 billion at a time from White Labs or Y Yeast. You get 200 billion from who are the company that do big packs of 200 billion? Imperial, which is really good. If that's in your ratio, if that's in your brew length, then I wouldn't bother making a starter from 100 billion. I'd just buy the Imperial yeast at 200 billion and go it. So here I'm making 1050, 33 litres, right? Now yeast go off, so the viability goes down as you store. So for this one, it's got a package date of 26th of October. And so at dropping off, I don't know if it's 5%. I think Beersmith does have a rate per different yeast because it varies, but just estimate it. If I'm brewing this on 1st of February, I've only got just under half of what I said I should have, right? And so immediately it says, well, if you need 410 billion and you've only got 500 million in each, you need 10 packets, right? Well, 10 packets is 80 quid. I'm not going to spend 80 quid on yeast. So there's your answer as to why you're going to set something up in the first place. So how are you going to do that? So if you go, and there's different calculators to do it. I've got another one that I'll show as well, because there are differences between the two, but they tend to correlate pretty well. It knows it's an ale. So if it was a lager, it would want, I can't remember, twice as much. It does have some other settings about whether you want to do a pro pitch or not, but essentially they kind of tally. And you know, the thing for me around yeast growth and touching back on the, could you pitch twice as much yeast and would that affect it, is essentially yeast are using the stuff in their environment and they're budding, right? So what they do is, you know, it's a single-celled organism and it grows another one on the side like a boil or whatever, and then that pops off and you've got two of them. So for every cycle that it can go through where it's got enough nutrients, enough sugar, enough oxygen and enough stuff to build a cell wall, it will double. And I can't remember how often it doubles, every hour or two or something like that you go through. So the difference between 410 billion and 430 billion is not a lot, right? Because if you leave it another hour with the right environment, you've got 800 billion. So pre-pandemic, I'm not sure many people could think in that sort of exponential way, but what you have to do is not worry about too much about the absolute number, 410, 412, who cares, right? The difference is whether you're going to be at 200 or 800. Well, the difference between 200 and 400 billion is only one doubling. So you put that in beer, one double and you're there. It's not that big. So even half as much as they say isn't too bad, and twice as much as they say it's not too bad. And generally people say it's almost impossible to overpitch at the homebrew scale, right? You're probably going to have to be 10 times much more than they say. And if you're growing that much yeast, you know, good on you. So don't worry too much about the absolute number. You want to get in the right ballpark, and that extra doubling will definitely get you there, right? So 410 billion. So how am I going to grow that up? And then they've all got calculators here. So if you assume on this side, here you've got some things you can change. So it's setting your 1036, 1040 gravity, that's going to be the same. If I put in and grow 100 mil, right, I have got down here 50 billion. Right. If I go up to 200 mil, I should have 100 billion, right? If it wasn't, right, I put in 200 mil, well, I've still got 50 billion. So how does that work? Right, I've just put twice as much water in, but I've not got any more yeast out. So something's going on. If I go down to 50, I should have 25 billion. Well, I got 67, sorry, that's 250. So maybe I didn't hit enter before, right? So let me sort this out. Let's start this again. 100 mil, 50 billion. If I put in 200 mil, yeah, I've still got 50 billion. So something's going on that I'm putting in twice as much yeast, but I'm twice as much water, but I'm not getting twice as much yeast. And I think these three graphs from the yeast book all show pretty much the same thing. But essentially, because of this way that yeast is doubling, if you put, you know, if you take this to extremes, the way I think about it, and you put one cell in 100 mil of starter fluid, it's going to double to 2, then it's going to double to 4, then it's going to double to 8. It's going to take a long time to get there. And all that time that it's trying to get there, if you put it in too weak, you've got the risk that if there's 10 bacteria in there, it's taken over. And the flip side is if you put 50 billion, if you put 50 cells in there and there's enough stuff to double it once, it's going to immediately go to 100 and then it's going to ferment. If you put 99 in there, and it's only got enough to go to 100, only a few of those cells are going to bud. In fact, most of them are just going to do a little bit of growing towards a bud, and then they're going to run out of nutrients, so they're going to stop. So you don't get that doubling, right? So there's a relationship between how much you put in and how much liquid how much starter you've got to give you an optimal amount of yield, as it were, right? So this chart essentially says, if I put in 100 billion, so a brand new fresh starter pack, right, straight out of you splitting the starter wort, or you buying it from the shop and you put it into, let's go for the easy one, well, let's start here, you put it into 1/2 litre, you will have 0.1 of a doubling, and you'll end up with, damn computer, where's it gone? My son's taken over my beer computer for online at home learning, so it's a bit fuller than it used to be. Right, so you put in 1 pack, 1/2 litre, you end up with 112 billion, right? So you've had 0.1 doubling. You've had a yield factor of 3.4. You double that, you put in a litre, you've got a yield factor of 7.4. But actually, when you start to go up, and let's be silly and put in 8 litres, you've got a yield factor of 5.3. So what are you doing putting 8 litres in? You're wasting 8 litres or 7 litres of DME, wort. You're spending money, and also you've got it so weak that bacteria and other things that are in there might grow. So there's an optimal range that you want to be in to go and get the amount of growth that you want, right? Which is why it might be good to do what Serge is doing and just build it up, but at some point you've got diminishing returns. And you can see here, this is the same sort of thing on a graph, inoculation rate. So this is how much putting, it's kind of the same thing, right? Yield factor, you want to be up here somewhere in the 4 to 7 range, right? And you can see it's quite a steep graph here. It's how much you're putting in, it then completely flattens off. So between here and here, all you're doing is wasting wort. And down here, you're in a real danger zone, right? So essentially there are calculators that work all of that out for you, but that's essentially why, back to Beersmith, why you don't just, do a simple bit of maths and say I want twice as many, so I'm going to use twice as big a starter. How do I hide all of you lot? Let's try that. Right, so how do you work that through in reality, right? I need 410 billion. I've got 44 billion, right? If I come in and make a litre, I will have 187 billion, right? If I put in 2 litres, I've got 266 billion, so I can just keep upping this number. Well, I've just put in 300, I've put in 4,000, it's not changing now. So you can ramp this back down to say, well, where is the inflection point where I'm not really doing anything better? 33, 266, 32, 31, 30. Type better. I'm just going down now until I see the number at the bottom change. It'll take a while, isn't it? Right, so somewhere around between 15 and 2,000 is your optimum amount. So you're not going to get there in a one go starter. You have to do 2 starters. So you're basically, it's got a button here to say use a 2-stage starter. So I'm going to do 1,500 on the first time. So it depends how big a vessel or whatever you've got. If you've only got a litre, then you set that as a litre. And then you say, well, what am I going to have for the second one? And it works that through. And it actually gives you some recommended starter sizes here to get exactly where you need to be. So if we put in 1.7 and then that's just under 1.2, right, that number there should be 410 billion, but you essentially play with that until you get your 410 billion. So
the number also changes. If you start adjusting your starter gravity up, you will see that your growth also changes.
yeah, I've never done that, but that doesn't seem to do it on here. What was it, 1036?
Yeah, 1036 is usually the recommended because, you know, it's almost like speed versus the output, but you can go higher if you need to.
Yeah. So Beersmith seems to be okay, and it's okay if you're just doing 2 starters. It's really good, I think. I use this if I'm doing 2 stages, or if I'm just doing 1 big starter, then I'll just jump into Beersmith and do it. And like I say, what I tend to do is I'll go for a yeast sales starter. I want 200 billion and I'm going to halve it. So I'll just change this 1500 there, seems pretty good. 1200 gives you just over. So I'll do something like that, make 1200, split it in half. And then I know I've got a brand new stuff, you know, I've got a brand new starter essentially, and then I'll just change the date of this to the day that brewing is, right? So that it's giving me, let's choose the right year. So I might go in and make a whole new entry for the yeast. I'm not doing very well here, am I? 20. There you go. So 96%. So now I've tricked this because I know that I've split it in half, or I might go set another Trappist gravity up with today. I know I need 400. I'm starting this time at nearly 1 billion, 100 billion. So what do I need? So now this time I should be able to quite easily get by second starter to 410 by 22.2. So I'll make a 1200 ml starter, let it settle out, split it in 2, and the next time I'll just come in and make a 2.2 litre starter and I'm done. If you need to do any the other one I quite like to use, if you're going to use any more, is Brewer's Friend. This has a much better, what historically, Beersmith didn't do a very good job with starters and water. In the last few updates, they've managed to sort that out. You'll find a lot of people use different calculators online from before. There's a downloadable spreadsheet you can use as well. Let me see if I can find this. While this loads, any questions so far? It wasn't too much maths, but essentially just
one point about viability, Lee. I had, I think it was a Y yeast smack pack, which was way out of date. The calculator showed 0 viability. I did actually grow it up, and it went on quite well. So I contacted White Labs, and he said the yeast starter calculators are often wildly inaccurate. So just a word of caution there.
Yeah, and I was going to mention that with this, Paul. So if you go to Brewer's Friend, and I put in exactly the same things here. So here we've got this. This is just an online one. You don't have to. I changed this slowly. What was it? 1050, 33 litres. So what did so this says I need 307 billion.
Yeah, the pitch rate is different. I think the pitch rate in Beersmith is 1 rather than 0.75.
Yeah. So I've often found these tie up. Actually, I was going to say they're normally really, really close, but maybe I'm not putting something in. You'll generally find Brewer's Friend and things put in. But as you say, Paul, if I put this, it pretty much immediately estimates this as 0. And then that makes it difficult to then do any calculations going down. So you can see here, you can just grab this from above. This does have different, let's just grab that, 100 billion. Let me put in a fresher yeast here. Oh, sorry. So it's saying it's 100%, isn't it? Yeah, so here's an interesting way to look at the difference between, to just do a little sidetrack, it's basically saying we'll end up with 368 billion cells with the stir plate. If you don't have any agitation, so this is if you just pitch without doing any shaking as you go along, you've got 208 billion. And if you can shake it every now and then, you'll get 258. So that's just showing the difference between not doing anything, 200 billion cells, and having that stir plate. Essentially, you're getting twice as much yeast out, which is why I think if you're doing starters, a stir plate is going to pay for itself in DME pretty quickly, I think. The other thing that's easy to see here is you can change this between general ale yeast. You can see it's got 1.75. For a lager, you're going to have to use twice as much. So as soon as you're making lagers, you're going to need a lot more yeast. And then I think a stir plate is essential. And if you're making big lagers, then, you know, some sort of oxygenation is going to be good. So essentially, I hit the same thing, Paul. Sometimes you go here because you're trying to do 3 steps and it says your yeast is so old, there isn't any. And then what I do is a bit of a hybrid, and I take the viability from Beersmith, and then I just adjust the date that it's made on here until this amount that it says you've got putting in matches what Beersmith has. So just a hybrid between the two. So, you know, as Serge says, they're a bit all over the place. You want to be in the right ballpark. You heard what I said about doublings and stuff. So even if you're, you know, close in numbers, you're going to be there. And I guess if you were really into it, you'd gradually tweak your own use of this to know what you've really got. I always kind of try and overestimate it a little bit or over pitch it a little bit, but I just generally try and aim for the numbers on here because I know that's then going to be reproducible as I go through. So this one's pretty easy again, it's online. If you don't get enough from this there, you click on, you put in your new starter cell, pull it all through from above, and you can go right down to 3 steps here. So you can use this quite well. I will often go in here and make something. I'll work out what I need to get 200 billion and then trick it that it's 100 billion and go on, if that makes sense. So essentially, I guess what I'm saying is, you know that you've made 100 billion because you've doubled your cell rate up. So then just go in here and play with the dates until it says you're putting 100 billion in, and then you can work out what you need to do. That's essentially what I do. For each beer, I'm generally making somewhere between 2 litres and 3 litre starters. I have got a 5 litre vessel. I don't like making 5 litre starters. I don't like picking the vessel up. Generally, for me, if you play with those ratios between the first and the 2, you can work out a way that minimises the amount of DME that you use. Sometimes you can save a couple of 100 grams of DME. It's not that cheap. Just rather than making 1 5 litre starter by making a 1 litre and a 3 litre, for example. I'm going to stop there. Hope that makes sense. Anyone do anything different?
Lee, I was going to say, would you always advise doing like overbuilding a starter rather than chucking new wort on a yeast cake or using saved slurry from a previous brew?
Not at all. Not at all. And I quite often will do that, Steve. And one of the reasons I bought Pico was to do that. So my next brew on the Pico is to make a bock, and I've purposefully changed the strength and size of that bock to be the perfect starter for a doppelbock that I'll make later and use that in. Or I'll quite often make a Trappist single as a starter for a triple. I just don't bother with the calculators then. I just use the calculator for the starter and put the next one on and just do the same each time.
I was just wondering, because in the slurry or the yeast cake, there is obviously tired or some dead yeast and some dead bits of shrub and hops and all that kind of, you know, half of it's junk in the slurry. Does that matter for that next beer? Can it produce off flavors? I was asking because I think I've come across it. That's all. I repitch sometimes, maybe 2, 3, 4 times. Usually try and make it, you know, try and be sanitary and do everything properly, but I guess sometimes not. And particularly today, I just dug out a lager that's admittedly only brewed 2 weeks ago, but it is cloudy as shit and it tastes a bit dusty. And in my head, I'm thinking, yeah, you've got like dirty slurry, basically. I've pitched on the, you know, 3rd time on a yeast cake.
I've not worried about it. The most I've pitched is I made a Trappist half, then a single, then a triple.
Okay.
Yeah, I do find they change a little bit. I mean, they really go off. I've found you don't need any oxygen or aeration for the 2nd, 3rd. You've just got so much yeast in there. It's not even going to bother doubling. It's got enough to just go off the bat. If you've got a conical, you could, if you know you're going to do it, try and drain off some of that trub. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the stuff that comes out of the Pico with all the trub in and none of it's filtered and it all comes out crystal clear. I'm not even sure any of that matters. And there is a train of thought that the trub has loads of proteins and stuff in that people like, right? So
Okay.
I don't know, Steve. I've never noticed it. I don't do it that often, but I will pitch like a porter onto a mild and then maybe a strong beer onto that. With my strong beers, I tend to make a wheat beer first or a standard beer and then put it in rather than spend days making starters. That Santa Claus I made, all I did was grow yeast for about a month. I was sick of it. You know, it's easy to just make a beer. You get beer.
And I've done that with some good success for like stronger beers. I don't know. I'm wondering if.
I mean, the contrary view is that, yeah, you're using up, you're putting a load of dead shit and detritus into your next beer, and you don't know what has got into that trub. You might have produced a clean beer in the first place, but there could still be bacteria that have got in there from when you were, you know, racking off the last beer. Essentially, doing this is a risk. It is better, really, to ferment your beer with fresh yeast. Essentially, if you don't want to take the risk, if you want to ensure that your beer fully attenuates and, you know, is clean and blah blah blah, pitch fresh yeast. If you don't give a shit, if you don't care really how it's going to turn out, or you don't mind, or you're experimenting, then yeah, then chuck it on. I mean, I've had experiences both ways where I've chucked a beer on a yeast cake and it's turned out fantastic. I've chucked a beer on a yeast cake and it's not finished fermenting because it's been a drastic overpitch. You know, and it is said that that yeast likes to reproduce. So the whole sort of overpitching thing means it's sluggish when it enters the new wort, and it doesn't go through the normal processes it goes through. So yeah, essentially, it is a risk doing that, and it's a similar thing with washing yeast or rinsing it. But I mean, you could go halfway. I suppose one thing is, if you're going to use some yeast from a previous brew, don't use the entire yeast cake because there's going to be obviously plenty of viable yeast in there. Take a couple of tablespoons of it, use that because that is still sure to go off like a rocket. And because you're using a much smaller amount, it gives the yeast the chance to reproduce and to adjust to the new environment and reinvigorate the fermentation. Yeah, that's what I would tend to do if I was going to repitch. Either take a few tablespoons to chuck it in the new one, or, you know, rinse it and save it a week and then repitch it. I don't think personally I would go down the route of putting a new beer onto onto a yeast cake. I just don't brew enough to want to risk wasting it if it all goes wrong.
I'll echo that. I know I've done it, and I do it, but I find sometimes you get under attenuation problems, and they just get worse as those things go on. I've had other times that it's just brilliant, and 2 days later you've fermented the second batch, and you can put another one off. And Steve, when I've done it, I try and rack the beer the same day and put the new beer on top fresh, but I have racked the beer 2 days before and just left the yeast in there with a little bit of beer on the top and pitched into that. Absolutely fine as well. I think in terms of contamination, Ken, there's so much yeast there, nothing else is really getting a look in if you're sanitary, but anything you've put in to begin with is going to be there.
That's I kind of agree with you both there, Ken and Lee. I've racked while the next beer is cooling, so I couldn't have cut it any finer, as it were, and then chucked the new wort straight on top, and it's kicked off within 2 or 3 hours. And that's don't always feel that that's necessarily a good thing, but in my head I felt like the yeast is alive and it's under a little tiny bit of the previous beer. Chuck a new wort on it and it's like brilliant. My new dinner is here, and it just piles away and just like eats the thing up within a few days. Rather than under attenuating though, this lager has gone from what normally would have been finishing at 10:12, a normal lager like starting at 10:48, finishing at 10:12, it's still chugging away. It's like at 10:06, and I'm like, it's gone diastatic, or it's like it's mutated, or I've got something in there. But I was pretty careful to just dump it straight on the yeast. As soon as I'd racked it, in went the new wort on the top. But yeah, it could be a fly in there. I could have sneezed. Who knows?
Steve, is it the same? Is this beer the same strength as the one you brewed before?
Yes.
So, in other words, the chances of an overpitch are much more than if you like leaders, and I tend to do the same. I'll tend to do a small beer, a medium, and a big, rather than if you go medium, 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 where what you've got in the fermenter is going to very quickly become way too big for the beer. And then, like Ken said, then I'll tend to take some out, somehow get some out, and just maybe pitch onto quarter of it or something.
So do you think it's an overpitch problem even with lager? There's like a litre of slurry, probably a bit more, on a 23-litre batch, normal size.
I just think you're asking for problems if you're always feeding it the same size dinner. It wants a bigger dinner, like Lee says each time. It's sort of, it wants to grow, and if you're not letting that happen, then
you're in that wrong part of the curve, Steve, because you just like I said, like you pointed out, I'm generally going much bigger, and so that first beer is effectively the right starter size. It's just you're getting a beer out rather than some supernatant that you're pouring down the bin.
It really pricked my ears up, that curve, and I've seen that curve before in that book, but I'd forgotten it. But yeah, I'm probably gigantically overpitching, and I mean, people say you can't overpitch a lager, but I reckon it looks like you might be able to, maybe. I don't know.
It does seem counterintuitive that overpitching can cause under attenuation. But
I'm getting an over attenuation. This one's just finished at 10, or is still chugging away at 10:06.
You've got to have healthy yeast, right? It's going through that cycle of budding, getting its metabolism going for the environment it's in, and then when it's going dormant, it'll pull in nutrients and set itself to sleep and build itself a nice cell wall. And essentially, you're taking some of that out when you're just running one to the other. Yeah.
The only other kind of variable in there, the only thing I'm worried about is because I do a bit of the lagers I do under pressure. And I've been looking up like the pressure kind of effects on the yeast, whether not during the fermentation, whether the pressure on the yeast is causing an issue, but because the hydrostatic pressure in like big breweries is probably about the same anyway, about 15 psi. But I wonder whether, and I've mentioned this before, whether I depressurize the fermenter on the day to kind of, so I rack off the beer and then the yeast is left at the bottom, but it's still under 15 psi. So then I release the PRV, it all bubbles up, and I swear to God, I'm giving the yeast the bends, and I'm breaking all the healthy yeast wall cells apart. I'm killing the entire lot. I swear to God, I almost have sleepless nights, and I'm murdering yeast, and and then putting fresh wort on the top of that, whether I'm putting fresh wort on the top of, you know, dying yeast. And that might be an issue. It's not the generations necessarily, the amount of generations I'm doing it, it's the way I prepare the yeast for the next batch, as in depressurizing it really quickly and basically exploding it. It feels like I've absolutely, you know, no proof of any of that, but in my head I'm like, shit, that looks bad.
We've got some champion lager brewers. Where's Rob? Was he just gone? I was looking at him just now. There he is.
There he is.
What
No,
do
I
you
am
do,
here.
Rob?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I've only made a few lagers and one silly strength one. But what do you do?
Yeah, what in terms of starters?
Yeah,
like big starters always help. And I tend to find, I think you mentioned before, pouring off the supernatant and then cooling down your first runnings and filling it back up with that, because by the time then you've done like the whole boil and chilled everything down and got it in fermenter. I don't know how true it is, but I get the idea that it's then building up with the beer. It's going to ferment and it's like full in exponential phase, and when it pitches in with a big blast of oxygen as well, I tend to get fairly good response from that.
So that's with a fresh batch of yeast each time, not
I'll often pitch onto the same one as well.
Okay.
And in that case, I tend to figure just the huge cell number helps. If you're pitching the same size batch on, I figure that's got to be a big over pitch, even without any fiddling.
Yeah, I'm in my head. I'm thinking the over pitch is probably all right, but I don't know what else I'm doing. There might be some sanitary problem, right? But there might be exploding the cells.
I don't think you'll be exploding the cell. I think you need to have blood supply for the bends.
That's good.
And nitrogen's nitrogen for the bends, isn't it? Right? Undissolved gases.
I'm asking a scientist. Thanks for that. That's true.
Great theory, though, Steve. I do. It's worthy of a book, that one.
Yeah.
I feel bad.
And does anyone pitch, like some people activate all their yeast and like to pitch them fermenting, but I think that's a bad idea, because like I say, you don't want them fermenting, you want them reproducing. And then when they're bored of that and run out of the stuff they've got, then you want them to ferment. So you don't want them, I get all my metabolism, you know, it's like going for a run or something and then turning into cycling and then sitting down. I mean, you know, they get good at doing one thing. So they're fermenting, and then you give them a load of oxygen and they reproduce, and then you go back to fermenting. And so I just kind of let them do their thing and then, you know, pitch them again. But some people liven them up.
It's kind of like Burton unions, isn't it? Where they're just constantly fermenting. They never really do a growth phase, do they?
Yeah, I don't know.
Because you're basically just taking, or like krausening as well, because you're taking the most active yeast. And
I think I read you either have your yeast in the same phase it would be while it's fermenting in your beer, or it's kind of ready to start fermenting. So you got the two phases. I read that somewhere, I think, in this book on yeast.
Krausening's for bottling, so you just want it to just do a little bit of fermenting and then keel over, because you're not.
You can pitch with Krausen, or it's not called that, is it?
I don't know. I guess that's my question, really. Whether that's.
It's on that Brewer's Friend thing. Oh,
It's in
Guile.
the book you showed. It's somewhere in that book. It talks about it, I think, where they talk about the two phases you can pitch, like your starter. Either it's kind of at the phase where it's kind of at the same position where it would be fermenting in your beer, or it's at the end of the fermentation, as you would do in your starter, and then it kind of starts up, and it's ready to kind of kick off. So
Right. There's a lot in that book. I ought to reread it. I did read several chapters of it over and over. It is a good thing to read about, I think. And for me, I don't
water now from the same series, and that's even worse, I think.
The water one, oh yeah, impenetrable.
It's going to take me months to understand it, I think.
I don't know. I mean, for me, the more I brewed, the more I realised it's more and more about healthy yeast, and that's when you start to get stuff that's reproducible. I think when you can sort your starters out and oxygenate it, that's for me when things start to happen at the same speed. 3-4 day fermentations rather than weeks and weeks.
That's what I was thinking when you were saying about overbuilding the starter and splitting it out. That's much more reproducible than chucking on a massive yeast cake, because there is potential for all kinds of, there's junk in there, there's potential contamination but if you've got the same yeast starter of healthy yeast without any crap in it, essentially, then that's a more reproducible state for the wort, because you've got yeast that are happy, healthy, ready to go, eat the sugar, and then they'll go to sleep, and that's the end of your beer, kind of thing, rather than, as you say, try and wake them up again and go, here comes a new beer, and you go, oh God, I was asleep. If anyone's ever been woken up when they're asleep, I'm like that. It's like, fuck off, I'm asleep. I'm sure
Technically, you're always woken up from being asleep, Steve, but I get what you mean.
I'll take that in the spirit it was intended.
Well, what do you do at the brewery? I guess you don't make starters; they're just pulling bits off, right?
I mean, I do, and then I try to be efficient. Other side of the coin, lazy, by repitching sometimes, and sometimes it works, and then third or fourth time down the line it doesn't work, and I'm like, what is that? And then obviously that goes in the bin because that's not going anywhere, or I try and distill it.
When you say it doesn't work, it doesn't ferment, or it just tastes awful?
Yeah, it's just like it's not good enough to let out the building to sell. Really.
Because obviously, like commercial breweries and even sort of the micros that have multiple fermenters, they can obviously crop right in the middle of fermentation, basically, and take that yeast off into another fermenter, so that you can have it obviously continuously running down the line, kind of thing.
Yeah,
it's not so much available for us.
Did once have to pour away like 75 litres because I repitched on 4 batches, and there must have been some infection in the first one, and then I repitched that into 3 subsequent batches.
And I've done that in the past, and
for all that decoction as well, Ron.
yeah. I shed a tear.
You don't know
what James to say
3 months down the line.
Yeah.
But I've done 3 batches in the same way that I thought it was going to really work, even with a recipe, or a process. And then you only find out 2-3 months down the line whether you've done the right thing in the past or not. It's really annoying. It's not like baking where you get your biscuits out of the oven in 20 minutes and you go, oh, I'll just do that again.
Does anyone worry about oxygenating when they pitch onto a yeast cake? Because you're not supposed to do that with the yeast in, are you? It can kill them, but you haven't got much choice, have you?
So I've done it. Ian, and then I think on another forum someone said don't bother, and a couple of times I haven't bothered. I can't see any discernible difference, but I've always wondered whether the last step in brewing is pitching the yeast, and I always wondered whether you could just put the yeast in the fermenter and run the wort onto it. So that answers that question nicely. Should always be the last step then.
It's funny because I've heard like people say, "Oh, well, for a big beer, you oxygenate twice," and well, obviously the second time you're going to oxygenate, you
there you go.
can have yeast in there. So,
and I do that for big beers as well.
I mean, I'd say like if you've got a whole yeast cake, that should be enough to ferment pretty much everything, shouldn't it? And so, and if oxygen is there for growth of the yeast, then I would have thought you'd need to, but
You got someone you pump it over. So yeah, I don't bother now for when I'm pitching onto a yeast cake. I just pitch and walk away. Sorry, put the beer on top and walk away.
I think it's because I'm.
How long do you walk away? Because you guys have all been brewing a lot longer than I have, but when do you start getting tired of watching it go off? I'm absolutely fascinated by it every time, and all this talk has been about nurturing the kids so that they can, and all that care and attention goes into making sure it goes off. Surely you still watch it, right?
I sit on the floor cross-legged and watch it. Swear to God, I do it. Like, look at that! Look at it.
Mine's in a cold shed. I mean, it's in a warm fridge in a cold shed. I ain't watching that at the moment.
yeah, same here. But there's always like that little bit of satisfaction when you check in and you see that sort of the crowds on top of that. And go, yeah.
I did come in from work when I used to go to work and quickly say hello to the kids and then go, I'm going to see my other kids and go out to the brewery and maybe I like to hear it bubbling or whatever. And you walk in. Right, guys, I'm going to head off now.
You're going to say goodnight to the kids first?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Lee.
Thanks, Lee.
Enjoy yourselves.
Cheers, Lee.
Good night.